Thanks so much for joining us for DCRI Grand Rounds this week. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Reeve with us here today from the Population Health Sciences Department. And he's the director for the Center of Health Measurement. And he's going to be here today with us speaking about assessing how a child feels and functions using patient-reported and activity data. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for those introductions. First, an apology. I know many of you, much like myself, was looking forward to learning about how dogs can help us improve our health and lives, and unfortunately, the previous speaker was sick, and so while an hour and a half ago, I thought I'd be enjoying a nice lunch in my office, and now I realize I'm up here standing in front of you. But I'm glad I had this opportunity to chat with you all about a subject that I'm very passionate about, which is trying to help better understand how children experience and perceive dealing both with conditions and illnesses like cancer or with asthma or with rheumatic disease, and then understanding how different interventions impact their lives, hopefully in a positive way, but unfortunately many of these interventions for such severe diseases has negative side effects. And so the work that I do and the work of the people within my Center for Health Measurement does is try to develop better ways that we can capture those children's experiences and use that information to help inform decision making both in research and in clinical care settings. And so the topic that an hour and a half I decided to talk to you about today is a topic that I was asked to present on recently with the Food and Drug Administration and with the National Institutes of Health, who are very excited in learning about how to use the different types of activity devices, for which I'm sure many of you have on your arm, and how we can help use this information to help us understand what's going on in a child's lives and how we can use this to evaluate changes in a child's health status over time. And so that's where I'm going to pick up the work. Unfortunately, part of the work I'll be presenting today is in a preliminary standing, which means we're still collecting data, so I won't have final results to present to you today. But I plan to give you some highlights of what our early findings are in terms of looking at the intersection of activity data and patient-reported data. And then I will present on some work a colleague of mine, Antonia Bennett at UNC, has presented in adult populations. So I look forward to having this conversation. Towards the end of my talk, I will have some Q&A. So as I noted, I'm always interested in how to understand how both the disease, like cancer, impacts a child's lives as well as the treatments. Because we recognize that even while we have a lot of improvements, and now we can say recently that most children with cancer will survive their disease, we recognize that these treatments can have a huge impact on their lives. I imagine probably 50, 100 years from now, they'll look back at some of the treatments we've been using and consider those to be rather barbaric, whether we're ripping the cancer out with surgery, burning it with radiation, or poisoning the body with chemo. And so I imagine that much of our work today is helping us to find those new interventions out there that are less toxic. In terms of trying to understand how a child feels and functions, there are a number of different ways we can evaluate how they're doing. And here I list the measures that are supported by the FDA and many other communities in terms of how we measure or evaluate patient experiences and perspectives, how they feel and function. The ones that resonate most for me are patient-reported outcomes. To me, that's the gold standard where I think the child or adolescent themselves should be the ones telling us how they're doing. Because past research has found that when we ask what parents or clinicians think that child's doing, we find that oftentimes they have inaccurate or incongruent information about what's going on in their child's lives. I spend my whole career developing questionnaires, and I have no idea what's going on in my adolescent's life. Even though I ask them, "Hey, Colby, how was your day today?" "Fine." "What happened to you?" "Nothing." "Anything good happen?" "No." "Anything bad happen?" "No." And that's all I get. So again, I know it's a challenge from the parent clinician to understand. So again, we're trying to develop questionnaires to bring out that child's information. However, we do know there are other sources of information out there to capture how a child feels and functions. One aspect are clinician-reported outcomes, looking at things about disease status, what we can get from clinicians. Another type of measures are what we call observer-reported measures. These are things parents might use to observe their young child in terms of their physical behaviors. And then the last type of measures are what's called performance-based outcome, PERFOs. And those are things like a 6-minute walk test, 6 minutes distance walking test, get up and go, grip strength, and other things like that, where the patient is sort of motivated to try to complete a task in a certain amount of time. The important thing about all these particular measures we use to evaluate how a child might feel and function, they all have some error associated with it, meaning that none of these measures are the gold standard. That means they are perfect without any kind of error. One of the quotes I like to bring up both in my courses and in my workshops is this quote from Werner Heisenberg, who's a German physicist, who said that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning, which means that, despite all we think about this data we collect on people there, we have to recognize whether it comes from a clinician, comes from a laboratory, or comes directly from the patient, they all have some type of error associated with it. And so the goal for people like myself, who are measurement experts, we continue to work and strive to make sure we're getting a valid and reliable assessment of how that child feels. And in terms of developing and assessing how a child feels and functionings, we've made actually great progress over the past 20, 30 years in terms of developing better questionnaires that allow children to express what they're experiencing and perceiving. And two particular measures I want to highlight that will be sort of germane to some of the results I'll present to you later. The one on the right side is called the Promis Measures. Promis stands for the Patient-Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System. This is an initiative that was initiated back in 2004 by the National Institutes of Health with the main goal to develop a set of patient-reported outcome measures that can be used both in research and clinical practice settings. And it measures many of the common domains that you expect it to measure in terms of things that are experienced in common for kids of different chronic diseases and illnesses, like physical functioning, pain, depression, anxiety, sleep disturbance, and many other domains. I'm focusing my conversation this morning on pediatric measures. There's also an adult side of Promis that's available as well, and those tools are made available for you all, the researchers and clinicians. With the Promis pediatric measures, there are over 20 different type of domains that are captured through the Promis system, and we have designed and validated our Promis measures for self-report between children of 8 to 17 years of age. Another system that I've also been involved in, so while Promis measures might be used in a clinical trial as a measure of efficacy as a primary, secondary exploratory outcome, we also recognize that it's important to capture symptom experiences in the context of a safety evaluation. And in the safety evaluation where we're trying to grade and monitor adverse events or adverse effects, myself and some other colleagues have devised a system called the PRO-CTCAE. Now, that's a very odd sort of acronym. It doesn't flow off the tongue very well. But in short, what the system does, it is patient-reported. It's a measures of symptom toxicities that children of cancer experience while undergoing cancer treatment. CTCAE stands for the common terminology criteria for adverse events. And so within the PRO-CTCAE system, again, there's an adult measure out there, which I won't be talking about today. However, for my part, there's a pediatric version of this which allows children and adolescents to self-report symptom toxicities they experience while undergoing treatment. With this system library, it captures up to 62 types of symptoms a child might experience, like nausea and vomiting, constipation, diarrhea, and other symptoms like that. The PRO-CTCAE system is bounded between for children 7 to 17 years of age. Now, we recognize as we're in the process of developing PRO measures that are more valid and reliable for children to self-report what they're feeling and functioning, we recognize that this is a challenging area. When I work with my adult populations in developing a PRO measure, typically in terms of making sure an adult understands my questionnaire, I treat a 19 or 20-year-old as I would treat a 50-year-old or a 70-year-old in terms of my testing. Now, with children and adolescents, as we all know, is we have to recognize and respect that children as they develop in their age, go through different cognitive development. What does that mean in terms of thinking about how we design questionnaires? Well, what that means is we have to recognize and understand what a 7 and 8-year-old can understand and do is different from what a 9 to 10 or 11-year-old can understand and do, which may be different from what a 12 to 15 or a 16 to 20-year-old can understand and do. And so therefore, we have to recognize that our younger kids might have difficulty understanding such complex questions or things about what is nausea or what does the past 7 days represent and mean to them. So again, those things we need to help understand in context. We also have to recognize for certain chronic conditions like cancer is sometimes those diseases can actually stunt their or delay their cognitive growth, and we need to respect that. And so therefore, we need to recognize that while I always want to use the self-report, the patient-reported data in my research and clinical care settings, there are times when we might not be able to allow that child to self-report, whether the child is too sick, their literacy levels they haven't actually learned things like what the past 7 days mean. The child might have a condition that they're unable to communicate. The child might be too young. We find that I just get down to age ranges 5, 6, or even younger, that they can't do self-report questionnaires. As well as we have to recognize that taking questionnaires is a burden. Now, the last thing kids want to do is get away from their video games and answer 15, 20, 35-minute questionnaires. As well as their attention span tends to get very limited in this population. This little cartoon, Calvin Hobbes, one of my favorite cartoons, and here's Hobbes asking him, how's that PRO survey going? And Calvin's going, I love messing with data. So this kind of kid sort of gives me nightmares about who might be filling out some of my questionnaires in there. So because of these limitations, we need to start thinking about, are there alternate sources of information that we can use to help us understand and capture how that child feels and functions? And so I'm interested in my own field in a whole source of different types of resources to capture it. But what I was particularly interested in is how we can start using these sort of devices that sit on your wrist as activity trackers to inform our understanding of how the child is feeling and functioning. And now there's lots of cool devices from that either sit on your watch, can sit on your hip, can be on your smartphone, and other type of devices that again can have this unique ability to capture all different types and levels and magnitudes and quality of activity data. There are a lot of benefits of using activity data, especially in comparison to self-report or patient-reported data. One is that it's passively collected data, which means that the child can wear this throughout the day, and this technology is not dependent on the child's cognitive ability or literacy levels, language levels, or their own health status. All they need to do is just wear the device throughout the day. The second advantage of having activity trackers, it provides continuous long-term activity data, whereas for PRO measures, we're focused on a single time point or in reference to a past week, whereas we can capture data continuously over time. In addition, as I noted earlier, these activity devices capture a whole range of information, and not just steps there, but a number of going up and down floors and other types of activity data as well. Now, as always, no device is always perfect, and the same thing is true for activity trackers. They too have their own sort of limitations. Among those things are, wearing the device is sort of an inconvenience. At the most, I wear a watch. I wore an activity tracker for 3 weeks, and I got bored of it, and I hate wearing things, so I took it off and never put it back on. And you can imagine a child and someone with acting like attention deficit disorder having this thing on their thing can be really a bothersome thing. In addition, they might not like to wear it during night. They'll take it off, put it next to the nightstand, and never forget to put it back on the next day for your study. In addition, for some of these devices, they need to be charged, and some devices require to charge them perhaps on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And again, to the extent that you're asking a child to pull something off, the chance of putting back on is starting to get lower and lower. In addition, some of these devices actually, if you capture data for a long period, need to be synced. And if you don't sync it, you lose that particular data. So again, there's another chance that the child could take this off, sync it, or have trouble syncing it, and then you'll lose up data because either they can't sync it or they forget to put the device back on. We also find that there's a whole range of activity trackers out there, and they all differ in terms of performance, in terms of reliability and precision for capturing activity. We find that there's variation in their algorithms of how they use a capture from one device to the other. Some of the devices are very open about how they actually capture and create the algorithms to estimate activity, and some have it in a sort of a black box and won't give you that information. The last issue is not really a limitation, but it's a challenge. You are collecting continuous data throughout your study period. And so therefore, there's a large amount of data to shift through and to think about what is the best analytic technique to both summarize and analyze that data to address your particular research questions. Obviously, I'm not the first. I'm always at the very tail end of new technology in terms of thinking about how we can use these type of devices in research and clinical care. I happened to just look up and Google to see if I could figure out how these devices have been used in research to date. And being the lazy person I am, I found a really nice review article in 2016 in Mobile Health News. And what they did was they went through clinicaltrials.gov website, specifically focused on use of the Fitbit activity tracker, and found 38 clinical trials that have used the Fitbit activity tracker. And so what I list on the screen are all the different uses of the tracker. Now, most of the research studies that are actually using these devices are using it as some type of intervention, which is, they want to see if children get more physically fit when they put on the device, or they use it actually for a different type of physical exercise intervention, and using the tracker again to evaluate and measure how many steps that child or how much activity that child is getting throughout the day. Very few are actually using this measure actually as a performance-based measure. Bayer, as I show at the last bullet, is looking at it as an alternative to the 6-minute walk test. What I've also found, again, looking through the literature, is that these devices are used both in pediatric and older populations and are used for a range of different types of chronic diseases. Now, what makes my study and the study of my colleagues like Antonia Bennett at the University of North Carolina sort of unique is we're sort of interested in the intersection between patient-reported data and activity data, and are asking to what extent can activity data can be used to either complement the PRO data, so how we can use the data together to help us understand how a child feels and functions, or if the child can't self-report, how the activity data can be used as a substitute for helping us understand how that child's functioning is doing. And so this is when I sort of shift over to talking about the research study we currently have ongoing in our ongoing study that's funded by the National Institutes of Health. In particular, this work is funded through the National Institutes of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Diseases, NIAMS. And this study was funded back about 2 or 3 years ago as part of what they call the Pepper Project, and that stands, I always have to look at it, for advancing the science of pediatric patient-reported outcomes for children with chronic diseases. The overall goal for this sort of collaborative network between investigating sites and the NIH is mostly focused on to continue validation of those Promis pediatric measures, both in the extended and new populations, but also reconfirm its properties in existing populations that we've tested before. In addition, as part of the Pepper network, we're interested in not just the continual validation of these measures, but trying to develop better interpretability and meaningfulness around the Promis pediatric measures for use in clinical care settings and clinical research settings. And so, as part of the Pepper network, for which Duke and UNC serves as one of the sites, myself and Laura Shainberg are the co-PIs for Duke, for the Duke project. We're also joined by Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Northwestern University. And what you see in the slide are each of the disease settings for which each of our sites are focused on as part of our Pepper project. But I'm just going to talk about our portion of the Pepper project, and in particular, our work related to looking at these activity devices. And so our study aims was to evaluate the association between activity and PRO data in pediatric populations under conditions of changing health states. And so we have 3 different disease populations or conditions that we're including in our testing of activity data and PRO data. One which I'll focus on in my comments this afternoon are children with cancer who are undergoing chemotherapy. A second group of children are children with rheumatic diseases, children with JIA, or children with lupus. And then our third group of children are children with what we call not well-controlled asthma. And again, so each of these populations are included in our study. Again, I'm going to focus on the children with cancer in terms of my preliminary study. For each of our groups, we imagine, again, the funding for this was relatively small. And so this doesn't substitute for a huge clinical trial or a large observational study. We simply wanted to collect some pilot data to get an initial look of the association between PROs and activity data. And so we have relatively modest sample size, but many of these match what I've seen out in the literature. We hope for each of our groups to have at least 50 kids. And what you'll recognize if you look at our sampling plan is, remember, as I said, is children go through different developmental phases. And so we can't treat the children, the younger children, to be same as the older adolescents. And so we have purposely stratified our testing between our younger children from 8 to 12 years of age, and then from our older children from 13 to 17, our adolescents from 13 to 17 years of age. Now, in terms of our study design, part of what I didn't know would be, but turned out to be one of the more challenging aspects, is deciding is what type of activity device do we want to include in our particular study. Now, thankfully, I was not the lead person for selecting that device because, again, technology is much beyond my abilities. But luckily, again, I could rely on my good friend and colleague Antonia Bennett at UNC, who works in this area a lot. And she went through both looking through the literature. She also developed some studies where she herself and her colleagues were about 50. Now, that's a little exaggeration, maybe, but honestly, maybe 7 or 8 different devices on their arms at once, and we just walk back and forth and see how well they did. Throughout all the literature and through testing of their own devices there, they decided to choose the Garmin vívofit 3 activity monitor. It is an accelerometer which captures all the sort of triaxial data that you would want to collect. In addition, what made the Garmin attractive for us in our pediatric space is it has a 1-year battery life. So we never have to ask that child to charge that particular device. It also can hold data for up to 30 days. And for our studies, we're never going beyond 30 days. So again, there is an opportunity that we never have to ask that child to upload data. It also is water resistant and has other types of features that we thought worked well. In addition, it provides reliable data in terms of step count for us. Now, for our particular study, Each of those different studies in each of those three different disease groups, cancer, rheumatic disease, and asthma, we have the sort of same feature in terms of study design, which is what we typically ask the child to do is to put on the device and then wear that device for 7 days. On the 7th day, we then go to that child and we ask her or him to complete our questionnaires, both our Promis Pediatric measures as well as our Pro-CTCAE measures. And I'll show you our measures in a moment. Why 7 days? Because each of those measures has a 7-day reference period. So you can see in this table here is the days of wearing the activity monitor. The PO captures all 7 days. So again, we can look at an apples-to-apples comparison of functioning and feeling. Now, the other unique thing about our studies, and we did this for all of our three disease groups, is we recognized that children are different health states. And so we purposely are evaluating how children's functioning and activity varies when their health state varies. And so, for example, for our children with cancer, our first assessment was they would wear the watch for 7 days and then complete the PRO data, what we call the baseline T1 point. This is before the child has been administered a round of chemotherapy, when they're feeling relatively less symptomatic. The next assessment point is about, for our children with cancers, after they've received chemotherapy, about 7 to 17 days, again, they're continuing to wear the device there, and then at a point when they're starting to feel much more symptomatic because of the chemo, we again have them complete the PRO data. So we have 2 different health states, and we're comparing the health states in transition over time. What we certainly do expect from our T1, our baseline prior to chemotherapy, to our T2 after chemotherapy, is the children's health state to reduce across those 2 time points. In terms of our study measures, as I've noted, we've included the Promis Pediatric measures, and we're measuring things like physical activity, physical function, pain interference, fatigue, depression, anxiety, and psychological stress. As part of the Promis, one unique features of Promis Pediatric measures is it includes adaptive testing, which allows us to get a relatively precise measure of their functioning or their depression, anxiety with a minimal number of questions. In addition, we include our Pediatric Pro-CD, which captures symptomatic adverse events. I think we included at least about 20 different adverse events we were screening for. We collected clinical data on these kids, like treatment initiation, performance status, and disease activity monitors. And we also included ecological surveys. These surveys allowed us to try to help understand what might be going on in that child's life during that week that might either accelerate the number of activity, like the kid went and played a soccer game or put their activity tracker on their dog, or things that might actually push down their activity, where it was a rainy day or things like that. So that's the purpose of our ecological survey. So let me talk about some preliminary findings. And again, I wish I could present our final findings to you, but we're still collecting data in each of those particular disease settings. But the results I pulled about a month ago when I put together these slides, we had information on a preliminary sample of 15 children, adolescents with cancer. I wish there were more, but again, we're still collecting this data. Here are the features of those kids. 10 had Hodgkin's lymphoma and 5 had ALL. 8 of them were female, 6 were African American, and their age range was between 8 and 17 years of age. And so in this particular slide, you're looking at all 15 kids in terms of their activity levels for these 15 kids in our T1 assessment. So that's on the left side here. And again, this is prior to chemotherapy. And then the information on activity on the right side of the screen is for those kids after chemotherapy. 2 immediate things that jump out to me. One is you do start to see the activity data going down in our 2nd week, which is what we would have expected. The second thing is, and what we're very proud of our kids for, is that all the kids had data. We never found that the kid forgot wearing their watch on a particular day. So in terms of feasibility, we are seeing for these short time periods, kids are willing to wear these devices in our particular study. One thing I forgot to tell you, which other researchers are excited about, is part of the incentive for kids to participate in a study and why we have good participation rates. One is we have a short study. We don't ask the kids to wear these for 6 months or a year. It's a short, within a couple of weeks that they're wearing it. Number two, they do get paid a small incentive, about 50 or 60 bucks. But number three is they actually get to keep the Garmin device at the end of the study. And kids really love that. Oh, really cool, I can track this on my own. Now, during the study period, I forgot to mention as well, is we turn off the screen on their Garmins during the study so they can't actually see their steps because we don't want that to artificially increase their number of steps. We do, at the end of the study, turn that back on so they can track their own steps. Now, what I'm showing you, again, I don't feel confident in showing you lots of analyses, or even, actually, I didn't even do any analyses, really, with 15 kids, because I don't feel confident about the numbers until I get a much larger sample size. So what I'm going to present to you is just very basic correlational analyses. And again, I don't have confidence in these numbers. I'm going to track and tell you which ones I think is starting to make to sound like it's real versus just an artifact of the testing. But again, you know, when I publish this study, you might see entirely different numbers when we actually get the final data in. So what you're looking at in this particular slide is looking at the association between the Promis pediatric measures and the daily steps at time 2 through the activity device. And what I've done for you is I've ordered the patient-reported data from those domains at the top that has the highest association with activity step count, and we actually use step count for our analyses, to those symptoms or functioning that have the least association with activity data. And again, I'm not going to dwell too long on these numbers because they're probably going to change drastically when we get our final data, but I'm not surprised to see the highest correlation of self-reported physical activity correlates with activity, and that in many ways it confirms that we're capturing something real here. But we also see that there's a negative association with fatigue. Not surprising that the child gets more tired. They're less likely to want to go out and do a lot of exercise. In addition, we see that mobility has an association with activity. Again, no surprise there. And we're starting to see pain interference and psychological stress have a negative association with device. Again, this is preliminary data. On our adverse event reporting system, again, so now what we're looking at is adverse events. This is at our T2 assessment, the second time assessment. And what we see at the top here, and not surprisingly, if the kid is vomiting as a result of their chemotherapy, yeah, they're not in really good mood to go out and start playing around and exercise. And so you see that moderate negative correlation of 0.47 with vomiting. Cough has a positive association. I don't know why that is. It's either A, the kid's just trying to go out and be active and is creating them to cough some, or B, it could be that the coughing makes them jerk the wrist back and forth there, and that's causing step counts. Or C, this is just a simple artifact of having a small sample size. But we also see other associations like what reduces number of steps are things like headache and nausea and pain itself. Now, I felt bad coming today to show you the results for 15 people. And so I also want to show you some work done by my good colleague Antonia Bennett, who has completed her studies a few years before mine, for which many of her study designs were elements we incorporated in our study. And so what Antonia Bennett did was looked at the association between the same activity and PRO in adults who underwent a stem cell transplant. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details of her particular study, but what's relevant for us is that this treatment, this stem cell transplant, is a very intensive, high-risk procedure for patients who receive curative or anti-tumor efficacy in the treatment for leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, and other diseases. It is associated with significant short-term symptom burden. And this particular study that they're collecting activity data was an intervention study, an exercise intervention study to improve fitness. And so the data I'll be showing you from Antonia's study is that there's an initial week of hospitalization. And so you'll be looking at data while the patient's being hospitalized. It's about 3 to 4 weeks. and then once they're discharged from the hospital, about 4 weeks afterwards. And again, they summarize daily steps on an average of a 7-day period, much like we did. So let me orient you to what you're looking at on this particular screen. I used to have this as an animation. Now it's sort of messed up. So on the left hand of our screen is the average activity data across 32 patients undergoing stem cell transplant. And what we see is the first 4 weeks are when they're in the hospital, when they're experiencing all those incredible symptoms. And as you can see, the step count and activity data is rapidly going down over those 4 weeks. And then at post-discharge, once they leave the hospital, as they start to get back in their routine, starting to feeling better, you can see their step count starts to go up. So we see that nice sort of trajectory from when they're in the hospital, their step count goes down, and then leave the hospital, their step count goes up. Now on the right here are some of the Promis measures for adults. These are measuring things like general health, quality of life, physical health, and other things. I'm going to go in more detail in the subsequent slide, but if you just look at the lines, you can start to see the lines have that same sort of trend. Now for Promis, high scores are good. So what we see here is it starts high, starts to go down until the end of week 4, it starts to go up over time. When we switch from the Promis measures to the adult pro-CTCA measures, which again are symptom adverse events. Now what we're doing over here is these, again on the left is the same activity data, so I haven't changed this in the slide. This is still the activity data that goes down and then goes back up. But now these are symptom experiences. Now high scores represent worse symptoms. And again, you see that their symptoms start to get worse up to the 4-week point of hospitalization and start to go down over time. But let's look at the actual data. I think it's sort of unique. And so this looks at, this analysis was a regression analysis she ran, controlling for other type of background characteristics and demographic characteristics and other factors there, and looked at the association between a 1-step increase in the patient-reported measure and how that associates with changes in step counts. And so what we see here, looking at Tonia's work in these adults here, is for general health, what that means is for every 1-step increase in the Promis general health measure, which is on a 4-point scale, that's associated with a 942-step increase on a weekly basis. So as their general health goes up, so does their steps. Other meaningful associations you see in here are physical health, their ability to carry out social and physical activities. Pain is what we saw in our study, as well as fatigue, are all associated with increased or decreased health counts. This is the symptom data from pro-CTCAE. And so again, the negative associations means as symptoms get worse, step count goes down. And again, if you look at her top symptoms at the top there, they're sort of similar to what we found in our kids study, even though we have 15 kids. So you see at pain, fatigue, vomiting, shaking, chills, and diarrhea, all those things are showing a negative association. That means they're reducing step count. So in other words, what we're seeing is there is association. Not only is this activity data tracking the child's activity levels there, but it's also associated with how they're feeling that day in terms of their symptoms and functioning. And again, this is an important building block for helping us understand what's going on in these patients' lives. So for my final thoughts, I'm not going to give you a lot of answers, but I'm going to raise a lot of questions. And these are the kind of questions that we as academic researchers strive for and think about, and what drives our future studies to help us try to address these particular issues that we think are either knowledge gaps or challenges to helping us move forward in this particular area. One of the things I want to talk about is the activity data itself. Again, even though we've all been wearing these for now 5, 6 years, I think there's a lot of unanswered questions we have, especially if we would start to use these devices in research and clinical care. One of the biggest challenges is, what do we do about missing data? How do we handle missing data when the person forgets to put it on during the day, or if they wear it for half the day? What do we do with that information, or miss it for 2 or 3 of the days of the week there? How do we handle it? Is that missing at random? Is it not missing at random? What's causing these things there? This is one of the things that we hope to try to address in our study and the work that Antonia is also doing as well. And what we hope to do is starting to look when we get our final data in to see is what is the percent of missing, whether it's within a day or across certain days. In addition, we're very interested in looking at our ecological survey and seeing if that helps fill in the blanks and help us understand why we're missing particular activity data. The second question I want to ask is, how can we determine what is a meaningful change in activity data? When I work in my patient-reported outcomes field and I'm measuring things like pain levels or physical functioning, I have to recognize that, wow, on our Promis measure, your physical functioning changed from a 62 to a 65. People go, well, that's nice, but is that meaningful? How does that relate to me? Do I, as a patient, think that's a meaningful improvement or a decrement in my lives there? And so we strive in the PRO work to try to address what are those number or magnitudes of change in the PROs. Similarly, for activity, if we want to use this in research and clinical care, we need to ask ourselves, what is a meaningful change in activity levels that is meaningful from a patient's perspective, that we're actually improving their lives or their lives are getting much worse? The third point is much of the work that I'm doing currently, I'm presenting today, is I'm talking about step counts and activity numbers there. But I recognize that there's a lot of other information that we can pull out from these type of devices that help us understand what kind of activity they're getting from, from simple things like mild, moderate, severe, vigorous activity to the things about going up and down steps. So all this quality information we need to think about. But how do we include that other information, again, to help us understand how a person feels or functions? Now, again, I'm sort of interested in the intersection of activity and patient-reported data. And so I have these additional questions that I have in mind, and investigators and colleagues around me have these same types of questions. As I noted earlier, when I have kids who can't complete a patient-reported measure, to what extent can I use the activity data as a substitute measure for kids who cannot self-report? So that's a loaded question. For example, what are the reasons a child can't self-report? Either A, they don't have access to a computer, they don't want to take the question, or are they too sick? That's an important thing to know. Or is the child too young? They're too young to self-report, and how we can use the information. So all these things about whether a child of an age to self-report, when they're missing data, how I can use the activity data, but for the younger kids, how I can use the information. Now, when I use the information, can I only use it to help and say and quantify how a child's doing in terms of the activity and maybe physical functioning? But can I push that a little further and say that, well, if their activity data is getting worse, does that mean their symptoms are also getting worse? So again, I hope to explore that particular aspect of how we can use activity as a substitute. However, if I can collect activity data and self-report data, how can I use that information as not each individual piece of information, but as a composite measure? I feel pretty confident in saying that when you have a self-report data and some type of other device like activity monitor, they're never going to be 100% correlated with each other. They're always correlated around 0.4 or 0.6. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. It just means they provide two pieces of information about what's going on in that person's life, and they complement that information. So instead of looking at each piece in isolation, I'm thinking about how I can develop this as a composite to give a better overall assessment of how that person's doing. The third question is, if we wanted to use a composite measure of activity data and patient-reported data as an indicator of treatment benefit, what kind of supportive evidence would I need to present to the FDA to make them feel comfortable about using that as a primary, secondary, exploratory endpoint? My last slide talks about not just what myself is, but what I think our Center of Health Measurement is at Duke, what we're trying to do and think about as we try to explore these issues in our lives for understanding how patients feel and function. And I like this picture. This is a picture Kevin Weinford and I helped put together. It sort of presents to you, in thinking about our approach as a center and for a field, how we can think about developing what we call a standardized approach to assessing quality of life across the lifespan. Wouldn't it be great if we had common metrics that helped us understand how patients feel from pediatric to geriatric? I think so. And so I think the challenge for us in our field there is we need to consider this sort of lifespan in age from when children are very young, baby, toddler, child, adolescent, young adult, all the way up to when adults and older adults. So I'm interested in our center interested in the whole lifespan from pediatric to geriatric. As we think about capturing health, we're also very interested in recognizing is there are different aspects of what health or quality of life is. And at a very gross overall level, we need to think about how people are doing physically, mentally, and socially. Now, if we were to take just one domain like physical health and think about physical functioning, if I were interested in developing a common metric across the lifespan, I need to ask the question, is physical functioning the same construct across the lifespan? I'm not quite convinced that's the case, what physical functioning is. For example, what is physical functioning to a baby or toddler can be very different for how we think about and define and measure physical functioning for a child or adolescent, which may be different from how we think about and measure physical functioning as adult or older adults. So we need to take that in consideration. In addition, as we think about across this lifespan and measuring these different types of health domains, we also have to recognize, as I presented to you today in my slide set, is that there are different sources of information we can use to measure people's health physically, mentally, and socially. And so as I presented at the beginning of my slide, we have patient-reported outcome measures, but we also have clinician-reported measures, laboratory measures, we have observer-based measures, and we have performance-based measures. And again, my interest is not just to use one of these measures in isolation, but to use these as a composite and use these to help us evaluate how a person is doing physically, mentally, and socially. And what we also have to think about is not only are we using these measures and think about a particular time point like a child there, if we're measuring something like physical functioning, how do we weight each of these sources in terms of estimating where a person is on their health physically, mentally, or socially? So for very young kids like toddlers, we might not put weight in a patient-reported outcome, but put more weight in observer-reported outcome. If this were an adolescent or young adult, we might put a lot more weight on the PROs. Again, these are the kind of fun things that we, myself, Kevin, and people in our center are very excited of working with you all about of trying to explore overall. So that's where I end my slides. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Focus on the developmental appropriateness of administering surveys in younger kids. And I had two questions about that. One is, have you all explored alternate ways of gathering information from young children, ways that are more developmentally appropriate than taking a survey, like having them do drawings or playing make-believe? There's a lot of literature in the child abuse field where they've been able to gather data from children that are very young that's even admissible in court because they feel that it's a high quality information they can gather. So that's one question. The other one is about the possible harms of asking some of these questions to young children. In particular, I do obesity work, and we ask questions a lot of times about children's feelings about how their weight, shape, or size affects how they interact socially. And sometimes those questions, especially in younger kids, can lead to tearful conversations, and so we do worry about the potential harms of asking.
Two excellent questions. Thank you for asking. Number one, first off, and what I want to emphasize in my answer to question and potentially other questions there is I see my presentation today as an opportunity to reach out and work with you all, very smart people who have thought about a lot of these things. And as part of my center, one of my primary focuses is on the pediatric space. So for those that are working in this area, I would love to actually find time, sit down with individually. I also have interest in building a working group surrounding these issues so we can discuss what's the best way we can help of different kids at different ages and different disabilities and limitations as well. So that's an open invitation that I'd love to work with you on. So as I'm starting to enter more and more of the space, I'm starting from a comfort area, which is my work is focused on self-report and patient-reported measures, and I want to start with an area I feel a little bit more comfortable with that we can get self-report data. So my work to date is the 7 to 8-year-old and older, up to 17. Once I'm done with this, not just this study, but my larger Promis Pepper study, is my goal is to start to reach those younger age groups and see how we can use different information like what you had suggested to help us, again, think about, okay, now if this kid's between the 5 and 6 age range, where does our PROs start to fall apart? Can we improve them? And what other information we can use? I'd love to have that conversation with you. On the second issue, this is about sensitivity to some of the questions we have. I agree. You know, it's a passionate area for me with pediatrics. I have kids of my own, and you know, and luckily they don't have any of the severe conditions that I'm presenting today. But anytime my kid gets hurt, I feel it personally, and it's challenging to think about some of these kids and what they're experiencing, especially when you talk about abuse and neglect. I do recognize, and we have to be extremely cautious that what we're doing is developing something that makes the kid in a worse situation. And so we need to be extremely careful and not have me, who is a person, I just do psychometrics and survey development, but get people who are content experts, experts working with kids, to work with us as partners to make sure we're not asking those questions that actually would put that kid at risk for worse physical or mental health overall. So I always work with content clinical experts who are pediatricians to help guide my particular work, and I look again for you and others to do that. Now, that doesn't mean though that we should shy away from asking kids how they feel. And I'll give you an example, 2 examples from my work. So again, I'm working with children with cancer, and we're developing this adverse event system which measures symptom toxicities. Within the system we're creating, which is called, I said, the CTCAE, again, it's just the clinical trials for oncology trials, adverse event for oncology trials there is a adverse event called suicide ideation in the metric. Now, the adults, when they developed it, they stayed away. No, we're not going to go in that area. Oh my gosh, you can't ask people about suicide. For the pediatrics, we said, why are we scared to ask kids how they feel? Now, what our approach was, we don't ask the kids whether they are thinking about suicide, because again, that has huge issues and implications there, but we do have a question in our survey which asks the child, have you thought about or have you hurt yourself on purpose? And again, that's sort of a proxy for suicide ideation, and it immediately triggers in our study that if the child endorses that, there is immediate follow-up. We had an example in one of our studies where actually a child endorsed that. It was during a cognitive interview, and it was an 8-year-old boy who endorsed, in the past 7 days, I had purposely hurt myself. And so, again, we have these protocols in place, and the interviewer said, now, can you tell me a little bit more why you said you purposely hurt yourself? And it turned out it had nothing to do with suicidality, but what it had to do with is the kid was on a pretty rigorous chemotherapy regimen. And it was creating that chemo fog, that brain fog that you hear about. And he was hitting his head like this repeatedly, trying to get himself to focus and concentrate. And so once the interviewer noted that, do you mind if I tell your mother or father and the clinician there? And they told the doctor, and the doctor had no idea the child was experiencing this issue. They were able to change that regimen and make that child's lives improved. Another area, I'm sorry I'm making a long answer, but you know, it's on the issue, especially on issues of anxiety and sadness. Now, that anxiety and mental health are those areas that when we're doing our interviews and doing our actual ongoing studies right now, we find that parents know nothing about what's going on in that child's life mentally. Now, they can be very aware if that child's throwing up and if they're experiencing pain, but when it comes to anxiety, depression, those are things that, you know, parents don't know how to ask their children about. And so it's an untapped, it's an undiscussed area in clinical care. But again, we have measures, and we are asking children to talk about how sad they are. Now, for many of our patients in our study, this is cathartic, not just for the kids to have an opportunity to talk about what they're feeling, but we actually have had parents come up to our interviewers and say, I want to thank you and your team because I have never found a way to talk to my child about how they're feeling. And your questionnaires have forced us to have that communication. Now, I also will admit at the same time, we've actually had other kids in our pediatric units that our interviewers approach them and tell them, I want to ask you about how you're feeling there, and actually the purpose of even asking that child to talk about what they're feeling has caused some of those kids, one or two, to actually break down in tears. Because they don't want to be asked about that, because they've been balling things up there. So we didn't actually do our survey, but again, it was helpful because then the clinicians could go in and work with that kid and get that kid the help they need. So I'm sorry for that long answer, but those are my initial thoughts in that area. I bet you no one's going to ask another question because I know that results in a 10-minute, and I'll try to keep my answers much more shorter. Yes?
So how do you see, you talked about how patient-reported outcomes, you're now seeing that on clinicaltrials.gov. How do you see that being used in labels so that patients, or in this case, potentially parents, can make better informed decisions about care?
That's an excellent question. So the question, well, actually I think it's mic'd, was how do I see PROs being used in the drug label for clinical trials? So the good news is, there are clinical trials that are emerging now which actually use patient-reported measures as an evaluation of whether it's a primary or secondary outcome. And so names will escape me, so I'm not even going to try to attempt where I've seen these, but there are drug labels out there, like for example, you promised there that using our drug X has resulted in a 10-point change in physical, like fatigue over time or something like that. So those labels are coming out. But I think actually a very interesting direction, I'm trying not to make this a 15-minute answer, is remember we're designing a new system for capturing adverse events. When you pick up your favorite drug, or maybe not so favorite drug you have to take there, you're looking at a very long sort of list of adverse events associated with that drug, right? And can hear these commercials that rattle on for 15 or 20 minutes about a particular drug. It causes nausea, vomiting, anxiety, other things like that. Now, the key thing to remember about all those adverse events you're either hearing on a TV or you're seeing on your drug label, honestly, all that information comes from a clinician who had met with a particular person in a trial, talked to that person, how you doing today, anything going bad? Okay, then they go back and they grade the toxicity if there is an adverse event. And so what we have found is that compared to patient report, clinicians tend to underreport both the number of symptoms but also downgrade the severity of symptoms compared to what patient reports. So what does that mean for our drug labels and the adverse events? That means all those adverse events reflects what a clinician thinks patients are experiencing, but we actually don't see what the patients are actually reporting. So I would love to see, it's going to probably be a long time off, but I want to see an active discussion with the FDA. I know they're very interested in this as well there, is whether there could be a drug label in the future where you have your typical adverse events as you would expect to see for any drug label, but there's another column that would be the patient report, and to be something like 38% of patients who took this self-reported severe fatigue or severe nausea or something like that. That would be what I would hope to be the future for drug labels. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.